It's a very strangely timed sort of intervention, this, isn't it, by the European Court of Justice Advocate General? I mean, if this was the case, why has he not said it before?
Well, look, a lot of people have said similar things in the past. You've had leaders of quite a number of EU member states. You've had Donald Tusk. You've had Emmanuel Macron saying that if the UK were to change its mind before the end of the Article 50 process, then, of course, we could stay in the EU. And that seems a perfectly reasonable thing, given that we've not actually left yet. And until we leave, we remain a member state with all the rights and obligations of a member state. And so if the UK public chose to take a different view, for example, through a people's vote, at the end of this process.
I'd really rather you didn't refer to it as a people. I'd rather you didn't refer to it as a people's vote on this show, Francis. Just call it a second referendum, and let's call it what it is, because it's not any more of a people's vote than the last people's vote, to be honest.
Okay, well, we could call it a third referendum after the one in 1975.
If you like, I'd prefer that as well. That's fine.
But the point is, the reason this is happening now is because there's been a cross-party group, I believe, Scottish MPs, who brought this legal action, and it happens to be coinciding now with this whole shambles that we're seeing unfolding before us in Parliament, where the government is trying to pretend still that the choice really on offer is between the government's deal, which I think probably you all agree is a deal that satisfies no one and solves nothing and certainly doesn't deliver on the promises that were made in 2016, or crashing out with no deal, with all the damage that could do. And I think what this verdict, let's be clear, this is advice from a senior advisor to the European Court of Justice. It's not a ruling, it's not a final verdict. But what this suggests is that, as most of us on my side of the argument have long said, that there is a third option. We can still choose to keep the existing deal we've got in the EU.
Well, we can't, though, Francis.
On the government's terms.
Well, we can't, though, because we've had a referendum, and the majority of people that voted in that referendum voted to leave the European Union. So it's not true to say that we have the option of remaining in it, because we've already voted to leave it.
Well, look,
isn't that the case, though?
I think I think the way this would play out, obviously, is you would have another referendum. You would have a referendum on the terms of Brexit at the end of this process. I don't think Parliament could simply just stop Brexit from happening. I think you would need a mandate from the people. And I think, actually, if you look at the way things are panning out in Parliament, we've got complete gridlock. There is no majority in Parliament for any particular form of Brexit. And it seems to me the most likely route out of that mess is to put it back to the people.
Yeah, but the one place, Francis, I mean, we've always known that Parliament is pretty much full of people who don't want to leave the European Union. Even those MPs who represent their own constituencies that have voted to leave are still very sort of soft on the whole idea of it, and they'd rather we weren't leaving. And I don't think Theresa May particularly wants to leave the European Union either, which is why I've always said, since the beginning of the result of the referendum, that I don't think it will actually happen. I think they'll continue to sort of, filibuster and put it off and, kick it into the long grass for as long as they possibly can. However, the only place where there is a majority of feeling for leaving the European Union is in the great British public, who have voted already in a referendum, call it whatever you like, where they said we want to leave the European Union. Now, it doesn't really matter to me whether we have another referendum, which will then be more specific, because you can't be that specific in a referendum anyway. There is nobody in this country that actually agrees with the person next to them about how Brexit should happen. But that's not really the point. The point is there are a large enough body of people who want to leave. And so that mandate has already been determined, surely.
Well, look, I think the first point to say is just on your first point about Parliament being, packed with people who want to remain. We've had more than 2.5 years now since about 2.5 years since the referendum. Mm. We've had both the governing party, the Conservatives, their effectively coalition partners, the DUP, the opposition party, the Labour Party, have all been committed to delivering Brexit. And so I think to claim that Parliament has been trying to thwart Brexit since day one,
well, it has,
is simply not true.
No, it is true. You really seriously believe, Francis? Do you really seriously believe that Theresa May and her cabinet of largely Remainer types has actually been, in your words, committed to anything?
Well, are you telling me that she's not committed
to
getting her deal through?
Of course she's not.
Do you think she'd rather... I just completely disagree with that. She's staked her entire political career on getting that deal through. I think it's absurd to suggest...
Well, I think you're being very naive, Francis.
In a sort of way to remain.
I think you're being very naive, and I
think you're being very conspiratorial. I think that's just a ridiculous thing to say.
Okay, well, all right. Well, so when the European Union comes up on Friday and says, well, don't worry, if you can't make the deadline on March the 29th, we'll give you a 3-month extension. I think that will happen, first of all. And number two, if it does happen, that will prove the point and prove the case that actually this is exactly what will happen for the next several months and possibly years to come.
Or perhaps what that means is that the Brexit that she is trying to deliver and the various commitments that were made during the referendum cannot be delivered. There were a host of contradictory promises. She's done her best. I
believe that. I think she has. I think she has
done her best with playing a ridiculously poor hand, where she was, Leave campaigners promised. For a start, we would have the exact same benefits when we left the EU. Liam Fox said this should be the easiest trade agreement in human history. We were told we were going to have extra money for the NHS, for all our public services.
And she has promised us all of that, right?
And we wouldn't pay a penny to the EU. And we could carry on trading with the EU on the exact same terms. Now, that is simply not true. And so the chaos that we're seeing in Parliament now is a product of the fact that Brexit cannot be delivered. And like I said, Theresa May's done her best. She's come back with a deal. I think it's arguably, the best she could have got given the circumstances. But it just turns out that it's a really bad deal, and it's not what was promised. And it's certainly not better than what we've got in the EU.
But surely, Francis, you and your organisation...
Dominic Raab have admitted that.
Yeah, but Francis, you surely should be able to see, as the Deputy Director of Open Britain, that this is actually not a bad deal for those of you who want to remain in the European Union. Because one of the reasons that she's getting so much criticism in Parliament from those who would like to leave Brexit with a bit of a harder edge to it is because it's actually quite a soft Brexit, and it means that for a few years to come, we will really have a similar relationship with the European Union that we have now. So I don't understand why Remainers don't like the deal.
Because as I said, because it is significantly worse than what we've got now, and it would turn us into effectively a country that follows all the rules made by the EU, but just give up our very powerful, influential seat at the table as the
Can you tell me? Because people say this all the time. Can you tell me, or give me one example, Francis, of when we have used our very powerful seat at the table to negotiate a better deal from the European Union than the one that they gave us? Because I can't.
Look, we've been
when have we ever done anything?
Powerful voice at the table since we joined the European Union in the 1970s.
I disagree.
We helped to build the single market, which is the largest free trade area in the world.
Total shibboleth.
Brexit is about free trade. We've created the rules of the biggest single market in the world.
Yeah, but that's not going to change. But that doesn't have to change. It doesn't need to change. It probably won't change because, as we've often heard, all of the people with whom we do trade are more than happy to keep that trade going. They don't want it to stop. They don't want it to suddenly become more expensive to trade with the UK, and neither do they want to buy things from the UK which will cost more money. So none of that is going to change, and so that is an absolute and utter nonsense to say that. And secondly, we couldn't even protect our own fishing rights with this so-called powerful seat at the European Union table. So what was the point of it?
Well, look, I find the idea that we've not been a influential...
Well, you haven't given me any examples of what we've done. You haven't given me an example.
Well, we created the single market, which is the biggest free trade area in the world. We brought
is that it?
We brought in countries from the former Soviet Union.
That was a bad idea, wasn't it?
Authoritarianism.
Well, that was a ridiculous idea.
Into democracy.
We failed to stop the war in the Balkans from happening after we did that as well.
Well, look, if you can really tell me that you think we're going to be more influential in Europe or the wider world outside of the EU, then
well, we're still. I believe we're still a member of the United Nations Security Council, are we not? And we'll still continue to be so because we were part of that before the European Union. We are not an influential. We are not an influential part.
That's an irrelevant point.
Why is it an irrelevant point? You just said we're not influential. We're on the UN Security Council. There's only 5 countries on it.
We'll be less influential if we leave the EU.
No, we won't. Why would we be?
I mean, I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree there. But I put the question back to you. Do you think that this is a Brexit deal that is good for our country and that will make our country more prosperous in the future?
I have no idea, and neither do you, Francis.
Young people.
I honestly don't know, because nobody knows. And in fact, everyone that tries to predict whether it's good or bad is absolutely barking up the wrong tree, misleading the public and being totally disingenuous to those people who voted to leave the European Union. What I do know is that we have voted to leave. Therefore, we should leave. Now, if this is the only deal that Theresa May can currently get, which is what she tells us, then we should go for it on the basis that that is what the people want. And if you are so arrogant that you think you could stand up against that tide of democracy and say, no, this should never happen because it's a bad idea, then I'm sorry you don't like it, but it's none of your business to stop it.
Well, I think if you look at poll after poll that's emerging about the deal that's on the table...
I don't care about polls. Polls got everything wrong. Polls said Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidential
you're in the minority
race.
Of people who think that this is a good deal and something that we should accept.
I didn't say it was a good deal, Francis, did I?
And contrary to what you said, the will of the people is not a static thing, and democracy is not something that ended on.
So you just want to keep going until you win. I mean, there's no evidence, for example, if there was to be a second referendum, or a third, as you call it, that you would win it anyway.
Well, there
really isn't.
Dozens of polls over the last 6 months showing a lead for Remain of between 7 and 8 points.
Dozens of polls, right? The last dozens of
mean,
polls said that Remain was going to win the last referendum, and they were wrong, weren't they?
Well, actually, going into the campaign, things were about level pegging, and they finished fairly close to level pegging.
I think it's pretty pathetic that all you've got to cling on to as a life raft is a few polls, Francis. Is that the best you've got?
I think what you're clinging on to is the fact that...
No, I'm clinging on to the fact that the vote was to leave.
It was taken more than 2.5 years ago.
Right.
The outcome of which has not been in any way delivered or fulfilled by the deal on the table, and public opinion is now shifting, and you think that the public should just be completely written out of the process and that
No, the public have voted, Francis. How can you be so ridiculous? The public have already voted.
What is your solution to the problem in Parliament? How are you going to get the deal through? Or is your view that we should just crash out with no deal?
Well, the point about parliamentary democracy, Francis, is that they have a vote. When they have a vote, I'll tell you how we should proceed. If the vote goes wrong for Theresa May next Tuesday, then she will have another vote. And my belief is that she will somehow, by hook or by crook, get that vote through. Because at the end of the day, we have to move on. We cannot sit here like spoiled children for the rest of time, shaking our little fists, crying out and saying, this is not fair. It's not fair. I don't like it. You know, in the end, Francis, you have to accept that the people have spoken and they have voted to leave the European Union. And that's the end of that.
Okay, well, look, I respect your view. You think that democracy is static and that people aren't allowed to change their mind.
No, I don't think it's static.
I mean, I find the view that, you know, in a situation in which there is no majority for anything in Parliament, I mean, your hook or by crook, as you say, she will get it through. Personally, I don't see that at the moment. I really don't.
Okay, well, neither one of us has got a crystal ball.
He's going to get that through Parliament. Where the votes are going to come from, which members of the Jacob Rees-Moggs ERG are going to suddenly, or the DUP are suddenly going to row in behind the deal, then fine, you can say that. But until you can explain where those votes are going to come from, just saying by hook or by crook is literally like licking your finger and putting it in the air and saying, I think, you know, it's just absurd.
And for you to say anything different is the same. My point is, none of us have a crystal ball. Many, many pundits have got this spectacularly wrong over every single step of the way. Nobody, apparently, despite the fact that everybody's got their eyes trained on Downing Street and Brussels, knew that the deal was even coming a couple of weeks ago. It kind of came out of the blue. Nobody saw that. Nobody had an idea of what Theresa May was doing behind the scenes. Nobody had a clue about how it was all going to work out. So you are, just as kind of ignorant as I am about what the future is likely to hold. We don't know. So let's see what happens. And when and if the vote is lost next week, let's have another conversation and see where we go from there. But, at the moment, all I know is that democracy is not static at all, but you cannot ignore it just when you feel like ignoring it. You have to admit that you lost the vote. Therefore, you have to give those who won the vote the time to actually do what the vote says.
I completely accept all that. And look, there's been 2.5 years of a negotiation with the European Union where the government has tried its utmost. I think we agreed on that earlier. It's not that the government has not tried to get a good deal. They've tried everything. And this is what they've come back with. It seems to be universally unpopular, although there are some, I accept, like you, who say, yes, it's not a good deal, but we should accept it anyway.
Yeah.
I think that's not it's not a very optimistic or sort of hopeful vision for our country, is, saying this is a bad deal, but we should just swallow it anyway.
Well, if you believe in democracy and leaving the EU, you should swallow it, because that's the point. We're leaving the EU.
At what cost? I mean,
I don't know. Neither do you, Francis.
Well, okay, but look, we may well be leaving the EU. As things stand, we are on course to leave the EU.
Yeah.
The problem I have is that we're heading for a situation where Parliament cannot resolve this, and there is no outcome, there is no deal on the table apart from the one the government has produced, for which there is no majority in Parliament. So
but listen, this is a fascinating conversation. I'm afraid we're running out of time, Francis. I'm going to have to say one last thing to you, right? If they can't resolve it, then that's not their problem in the end, because in the end we've already solved it by having a referendum. It's not up to... It's only Parliament that have suddenly come in at the end and decided they want to ratify it, and because of Theresa May's ineptitude, she's allowed them to do so. That doesn't mean that because they can't figure it out, that it won't actually happen.
Well, I disagree. I think Parliament has a duty and a responsibility to deliver what they've been instructed to do, and that's what they're trying to do at the moment.
To leave the European Union.
If it turns out they're not able to do that in a way that doesn't fundamentally damage our economy, potentially lead to stockpiling of medicines and all kinds of things that certainly were not on the ballot paper in 2016.
Let's not go for the scaremongering
the
line,
public should have a say over it. I think the public
had a say.
Absolutely appalled to have.
We've had a say. Let me ask you one final question, Francis. When, and it will happen, believe me, we do leave the European Union, you'll have to go and get a proper job, won't you? What are you going to do?
Well, I've not thought that far ahead. I'm focused at the moment on making sure we get a people's vote.
Okay.
Hopefully,
don't call it that.
EU,
you can't call it that.
I can't call it a people's vote.
No.
Why is that?
I've told you at the start of the show.
I think every member of the public should be allowed a say.
Yeah, we've already had it, Francis. We had it 2.5 years ago. There was a referendum. You seem to have forgotten. Thank you very much indeed. Francis Grove-White, Deputy Director of something called Open Britain. I'm not quite sure what that means. And I'm not quite sure how long Open Britain will be open for business for. Because when we do leave the European Union, Open Britain will become redundant.